Hey there, everybody. Pete Pardo from Tranquility. Welcome to another edition of our YouTube show focusing on rock biographies and autobiographies. This is part 3 in our series. Honestly, I'm just amazed at how much positive reaction we've been getting to these types of shows. Apparently, you guys want to hear about some of the cool books that are out there to read on many of our favorite artists and rock stars and so on and so forth. And I'm even more amazed at how many of these I actually have and have read. So let's get started, shall we? I've got if you can see the huge stacks I've got here in front of me, it's just ridiculous, and there's more. But we'll cover what we can, right? So first one I'm going to take a look at here today. This this guy is one of my all-time guitar heroes. He's been an inspiration to me for since I was a kid. And, his work with Deep Purple and Rainbow is just so legendary and just so important to me personally that I was pretty happy to see an actual book come out on him. Of course, I'm talking about Ritchie Blackmore. It's called Black Knight, the Unauthorized Ritchie Blackmore story. All right. Pretty decent. There's, as far as I know, this is the only book on Ritchie Blackmore. There's lots of books you can read on Deep Purple, and you got Martin Popoff's book on Rainbow, but as far as like the man himself, for a guy that's been so controversial and so shrouded in mystery all these years, I'm actually more surprised that there's not more books on Blackmore. But this is a pretty good one, filled with all sorts of vintage photographs and what have you, and gives you a little bit of insight into the life of Blackmore, the guitarist, Blackmore the man. The fights with his old mates in Deep Purple and all the upheaval and personnel and Rainbow, and of course moving into Blackmore's Night and his change to more acoustic medieval music and so on and so forth. Some tales of, he's apparently had an eye for the women back in the day as well, so you get a little bit of that. But overall, not a mind-blowing book, but a fun book if you're a Blackmore fan. Of course I am, so it was actually kind of cool to read this. All right, next, we've covered some Rolling Stones stuff and Rolling Stones related. So this one, of course, is written by the man himself, Mr. Keith Richards. This is Life. This came out a few years ago. Pretty thick book. You read something like this, and again, you're amazed that Keith is still living and healthy after all he's put his body through over the years. So here you get a lot of history of his upbringing, his childhood, and of course the early days of the Stones and all the craziness that was the 70s and the early 80s. The sex, the drugs, the rock and roll, all that kind of stuff. I hate to keep saying that, but that's what some of these books are really all about. A bit of the music, of course, some guitar stuff as well, and what he's been doing kind of lately. So there's that. Pretty fun. Here's one I just picked up on a whim, just because I'm interested in a lot of the people that this woman has been affiliated with over the years, and I figured this would be kind of a fun read. From a groupie's perspective. I think you have an idea probably who I'm talking about. It's I'm with the Band: Confessions of a Groupie by Pamela DeBar. All right. So, of course, the whole story. She had all sorts of liaisons with so many of the, top rock stars of the late 60s, early 70s. Morrison and Jagger, and of course, she wound up marrying Michael DeBar, but she had Jimmy Page, all sorts of it. It's all in here. So if you want a kind of really juicy tell-all from a groupie's perspective of what it's like to be, out there on the road and at the shows and meeting up with the rock stars backstage and having little, meetings, so to speak, with a lot of the legendary rock stars of the day, you'll probably like this. It's kind of a fluff book, right? But I like a guilty pleasure type of thing. But I was compelled to read it. I read it. I was kind of like, all right, that's pretty interesting. So there is that. All right, another book that kind of, I mentioned in last week's show, in part 2, that the Don Felder book kind of like reignited my love for reading these rock bios and autobiographies. And that is true, but also right at the same time I read this one here, and this also really kind of got me and really pulled me back in. This is Eric Clapton's autobiography. This one here is kind of really compelling because it tells the tale of a kind of very young musical genius who, had a lot of fame and praise very early on in his career. And, maybe he wasn't quite ready for that yet. So, it talks a lot about Clapton's early days, as well as, John Mayall's Blues Breakers, and then the superstardom with Cream, and then, breaking off with Cream and going into the supergroup Blind Faith, and then the Derek and the Dominoes, and then falling in love with Patty Harrison, George Harrison's wife, getting rejected, and his descent into heroin addiction and alcoholism, which would basically carry him through like most of the 70s and into the 80s. And then, of course, his late renaissance, becoming like a pop star and blues star, and then, of course, the terrible tragedy of his son dying, and, so on and so forth. So not the happiest read ever, but again, really takes you, Clapton lets it all out here. So I found this to be a really, really fascinating read. Here's one. I've had this one for like a million years. I think I got this back in the 90s, I believe this came out. Maybe the early 2000s. I don't know. But it's kind of more of a, kind of like a picture book with some history of the band. So this is called Genesis, I Know What I Like by Armando Gallo. If you are a fan of Peter Gabriel era Genesis, as well as like those first couple of years, basically 70s Genesis, so when Peter left and then Phil took over, all those albums and tours, from like, say, Trespass through Wind and Wuthering, you must get this. I'm not even sure if this is still available. I paid a lot of money for this when it first came out, and it might be out of print, but just to give you an idea, it's just a gorgeous, gorgeous book, and littered with classic photographs, live and in the studio, of the band back in the day. Look at some of this stuff, with a fair amount of, factual information of the albums and the tours and whatnot. It's just, if you're a lover of Genesis, 70s Genesis, okay, the classic era of the band, you need this. Plain and simple. It's a great one. All right, what else we got here? Stevie Nicks, Visions, Dreams, and Rumors by Zoe Howe. We've heard a lot of the stories of all the crazy stuff that went on in the Fleetwood Mac band from the Nicks Buckingham era and on, and you get it all here, but of course it's more the life of Stevie Nicks, obviously. So, pretty fun read, I thought. I actually, I have the Mick Fleetwood book here somewhere also. I'll probably talk about that in another episode. That's actually a lot of fun as well. But this was pretty cool if you're a Stevie Nicks fan, or you're just a Fleetwood Mac fan and want to find out about all the kind of affairs and the drugs and the lengthy studio times and the bickering and the crazy tours and all that sort of thing. Check that one out. All right. So here, yeah, this one kind of got a lot of flack, and I read it just because I'm a Kiss fan, and it's kind of fun. But Gene he's such a character. So this is Kiss and Makeup by Gene Simmons. This guy's just a piece of work, and this is not the thickest book on the planet. What are we at? About 250 pages. Talks a lot about the early days when he was a kid, Jewish kid growing up, and meeting Paul Stanley and forming the band. And of course, he bitches and moans a lot about the record industry and the his bandmates, Ace Frehley and Peter Criss and blah blah blah, and talks about how he made all this money and how a good marketing guy he is and all that kind of stuff. So not one of the best autobiographies I've ever read, but hey, whatever, it's Gene. You kind of expect that going in. So there's that. This is called Reinventing Metal, The True Story of Pantera and the Tragically Short Life of Dimebag Darrell by Neil Daniels. Another one of those Neil Daniels books that's kind of a pretty good read, but you get done and you're like, I don't know how much more I learned about Dimebag and Pantera than I didn't already know. You see some inconsistencies and sloppy writing. I think sometimes that Neil he's got a good heart and he knows a lot of stuff. But he just tries to pump these books out really, really quick, and I don't know. Maybe it's the fault of the editors who are just not really going and double checking some of this stuff. But a cool, fun, brief read on Pantera if you want to know a little bit more about the band. What else we got here? Dark Star, the oral biography of Jerry Garcia by Robert Greenfield. If you're a Dead fan, there's a million books on the Dead and Jerry Garcia and Phil Lesh and Bob Weir. There's so many books out there. I I just happened to grab one day. I was like eeny, meeny, miny, mo when I was in a bookstore, and I just picked up this one. Good read. Tells a lot about, like the early days of the band, but, more importantly, this book is basically filled with kind of like commentary from a multitude of individuals who were involved in the Grateful Dead family over the years, talking about the band and talking about Jerry. It's another one of those tragic tales, like Jerry's last bunch of years, not the happiest ever. He was not a very healthy guy. And, if you want to know a little bit more about Jerry Garcia from the mouths of many, it's definitely one to investigate. All right, 2 from Martin Popoff here. We've got Blue Oyster Cult Secrets Revealed, which I believe has been recently updated, if I'm not mistaken. A good kind of like frequently asked questions and bits of information on the band Blue Oyster Cult. Another act that like we don't see enough books on or enough information of. But again, Martin likes to go the whole album by album type of thing. So if you're a Blue Oyster Cult fan, I recommend this. I might actually want to check out the latest version because can never have too much. Blue Oyster Cult. And we got Dio, Light Beyond the Black. Talks about Ronnie James Dio and the various albums after he left Black Sabbath and whatnot. Again, pretty cool read, not a very big book. This is not even 200 pages. So, good kind of introduction for anybody who's looking into getting into the music of Ronnie James Dio and his band. All right, so a few of you who have asked, well, what about Sammy Hagar's book? Well, of course we were going to get to that at some point. So this is Red, My Uncensored Life in Rock. All right, this was a bestseller. A lot of people talked about this. This was a lot of fun. This is, again, one of those books where, written by the man, and, everything I've ever heard about Sammy Hagar, I heard he's a really cool guy to hang out with. He's very personable, a lot of fun, just an all-around great guy. And that's what you get when you're reading this. You actually feel like you're sitting down next to Sammy, maybe out on the beach, having a Mai Tai, whatever, and he's just telling you all the stories about his days in Montrose and the ins and outs of Van Halen and the Van Halen brothers and, his solo stuff and all the weird kind of things that were going on with David Lee Roth and so on and so forth. So it's just a fun read. This guy's led a great life, right? So it's like he's one of those guys that, like, if you could just kind of step in his shoes for a bit and just experience some of what he's experienced. I really enjoyed this one a lot. I'm sure probably many of you have already read it. What else? All right. This is kind of a cool one. Again, the fact that there was actually a book on this band, like, blew my mind. I'm like, I got to read that. This is Power, Passion, and Beauty, the story of the legendary Mahavishnu Orchestra. Okay, John McLaughlin, Billy Cobham, Jan Hammer, and company. I dug this only because it's just like, it's like one of the best jazz fusion bands ever. Not a band that had like these huge personalities or anything like that. To kind of the music told the story. So this is more like kind of like the chronological history of the band and the albums and, some of the cool tours they did and the lineup changes and all that sort of stuff. It hints a little bit at each of the individual members and kind of what was going on with them. Overall, not the most compelling book ever, but because it's like, this is like a one-of-a-kind thing, as a fan, gotta have it, gotta read it, right? So, all right, from there, read this one a while ago. It's been out for a bit. This is a guy who's basically retired from the his music career, and he decided to write a book about it. So this is Bill Bruford, the Autobiography. Of course, Bill, the acclaimed, legendary drummer of Yes and King Crimson. And here he just basically tells all about his life and his time spent with both bands. And he's very, very honest about all of it. And, you can tell that Bill is probably a little kind of bitter about the music industry in general. And I think, he's one of those guys that probably, he was in 2 very successful bands, but I don't think he ever made a ton of money. And I think all the touring really got to him. So he talks a lot about that. He talks a lot about his technique and things like that. At some points, it's a little more technical in nature about, the kind of creation of the music and his playing. But I think it's a good, honest book that I enjoyed reading quite a bit. All right, from Dave Thompson, we've got the Deep Purple story, Smoke on the Water. Again, another of quite a few Deep Purple books that are out there. I think I enjoy Popoff's books a little bit better because they talk a little bit more about the music. Here you talk about the band and the various incarnations of the band and all that kind of stuff. It's actually still a pretty cool read. I'm a huge Deep Purple fan, so I did enjoy this, but there are others that I liked a little bit more. But a pretty cool book. Lacking some photos, though, man. Not a hell of a lot in there, but it's still pretty cool. All right, if you're a fan of the Jefferson Airplane and Jefferson Starship, you're going to want to read this. This is Grace Slick, Somebody to Love, a rock and roll memoir. This is a lot of fun. So, if you're into like 60s rock and roll and the psychedelic era and, the San Francisco scene, the Airplane were a huge band. And there's always been a lot of talk about all the weird stuff that went on behind the scenes with the Jefferson Airplane and then the Jefferson Starship. So you kind of get all that. This woman was, another total character who has lived a ridiculous life. And she lets it all out here. It's pretty cool. Again, another really cool tell-all book. So you get all the dirt on all the, the different relationships she had, all of the various musicians in her band and other bands. The music's here. She talks about Woodstock and all that kind of stuff. So Altamont, she talks about all this, and then the later years as well, which is just as interesting. A lot of Jefferson Starship dirt too. So that's a lot of fun. I enjoyed that one. All right, God, I got all the stuff here within my grasp. Is This the Real Life? The Untold Story of Queen by Mark Blake. Pretty cool book. As you can imagine, the majority of it's about that man right there, Mr. Freddie Mercury. But it's just a really good, overview of the history of Queen, the band, and how they kind of rose from very humble beginnings to be this just larger-than-life group. And, of course, then the sad later years with Freddie. So, but, really, really good book. I enjoyed that a lot. There's a lot of books on Queen and Freddie Mercury out there, so you got so many to choose from. All right. From Mark Putterford, we've got Phil Lynott, the rocker. Phil from Thin Lizzy. This is not a huge book. This is, again, just over 200 pages. But a really good in-depth look at the life of Phil Lynott, the founder and mastermind, songwriter, bass player, singer of Thin Lizzy. Talking about some of the different incarnations of the band, the music, as well as just kind of his life behind the scenes. And again, this is another one of those tragic tales. As many of you know, Phil died way too young after years and years and years of drug and alcohol abuse. And, this is not a pretty book by any means, but, it is what it is. I mean, you can't really paint a great picture of a life of someone like this other than, the music that he created, which, of course, is legendary. But, a guy that left us way too soon. All right, another one that was asked for by you guys. This is also another, tell-all book with lots of juicy details and dirt. This is Mustaine. All right. From the mouth himself, this is another guy that probably, kind of like the Glenn Hughes book, another guy who just was on this path of destruction with himself for so many years. He's probably lucky that he's still alive. So all the crazy shenanigans, the music, the battles, the drug addiction, it's all here, right from the horse's mouth. Another highly entertaining read that, gives you some, a lot of kind of background information on kind of what went on within Megadeth. What was it like to be Dave Mustaine? How did he deal with, the getting tossed from Metallica and having to rebound from that, create his own band and the competition between the two bands. And, he had a lot of different bandmates over the years, a lot of upheaval in the lineup, a lot of drugs, right? Kind of found himself a little later in life. So again, the end of the story is pretty good, but a lot of real juicy stuff in there. So check that one out. Okay. I was going to say we're winding down. I may have to save some of this for another episode, but Randy Bachman, Taking Care of Business by John Anarson and Randy Bachman. All right. Another cool telltale book from the horse's mouth. Of course, Randy Bachman, famous guitar player, vocalist from the Guess Who and Bachman Turner Overdrive, one of the best Canadian hard rock exports ever. These guys were huge, never critical darlings, but the fans loved them. They sold lots of records, and Randy talks a lot about, battles with bandmates and record labels, and talks about, guitar playing, his style, guitars. You get a lot of, he talks about his ex-bandmates and the ups and downs in the Guess Who, and then, rocketing back up to stardom with Bachman Turner Overdrive and the later years and all that kind of stuff. His Christianity and whatnot, or actually, no, he's a Mormon, sorry. It's kind of all here. Kind of a fun book. I dug it. Oh, what else? All right, so here's one. Is this the one I was looking for? Well, anyway, it's in my stacks I'll talk about. So Jimmy Page, Magus, musician, the man, and unauthorized biography by George Case. This one does talk a bit about Zeppelin, obviously, but this is more about him, okay? And goes into a lot of detail about Jimmy's battles with drugs and alcohol and the women and the dips into the occult and all that kind of stuff. So kind of like the man behind the scenes of Led Zeppelin, the mythical, legendary Led Zeppelin. So again, there's a lot of Jimmy Page books out there on the market. I got some cool photos in there, but I did enjoy that one. That's pretty good. All right, Who Are You? The Life of Pete Townsend by Mark Wilkerson. This is a giant book. Pete's got his own book. And I haven't read it yet. It's in my stack to be read. So his autobiography is out. This is obviously written about him. This is a very good book. It's enormous. But if you are a Who and Townsend fan, you should look into this. This gives you all the information you'll ever want to need about Pete Townsend all throughout the years, and again gets pretty in depth with a lot of his personal demons and things like that, because he went through a rough period as well. Talks a lot about Keith Moon, the death of Moon, and whatnot. In fact, I have that Keith Moon book here somewhere too. I'm gonna have to pull that out next time. That's a great one. All right, Joel Mcciver again. Black Sabbath: The Complete History of What Evil Lurks. Okay, another big book, a lot jam-packed with photographs and things and history of. Yeah, this is one of those books that not meant to be a all-encompassing. I think this is one of Joel's better books because it's like, it basically, it talks a lot about the Ozzy years, but it's mostly like, here's some factual information about the albums, about the tours, pictures of the band, live in the studio. Doesn't get too in-depth in the later years as much. It's mostly like the 70s, but, it does obviously touch on the Dio years and a bit of the Tony Martin years, but it's mostly kind of centered around the Ozzy eras of the band. But it's a cool big book and well put together, a lot of great photographs. So it's one of my favorites from Joel Mcciver. So here's a great one that I read not too long ago. And again, this is something that, like, a band that you're not going to find many, if any, books on. It's called Alvin Lee and 10 Years After: The Visual History by Herb Starr. And I believe Herb is no longer with us. So, but I think his wife or his sister, I forget, is still selling this book in honor of him. This is just basically a visual biography and documentation of Alvin Lee and 10 Years After. The singles, the albums, the tours, a little history of the band. A lot of great photographs, live photographs, all in black and white. Pictures of like concert stubs and venue posters, and so you can see who they toured with, and a lot of information on the tours and things like that. A really, really cool book if you're a fan of Alvin Lee and 10 Years After. All right, from Peter Ames Carlin, we've got Bruce. Okay, Life and Times of Bruce Springsteen. Pretty good book. It talk a lot about like the early years in the 70s and the 80s, all the way up to present day. And if you kind of live on the East Coast, right, or maybe you're from New York or New Jersey or whatever, you'll appreciate this book because it talks a lot about kind of growing up here on the East Coast, and specifically here in New Jersey, the Jersey Shore area, and it's got that feel, right? I'm a New Yorker, so it doesn't matter whether I'm a huge fan of Springsteen or not. I do like his music, but it's like I could relate to a lot of this because it's just like reminded me when I was growing up, and so I appreciate that. Good. All right, here we have Snakes, Guillotines, Electric Chairs: My Adventures in the Alice Cooper Group. Of course, this is written by Dennis Dunaway, classic member of the band. This is pretty cool. Not the biggest book in the world, but Dennis talks about that classic Alice Cooper band lineup before Alice decided to go solo as Alice Cooper. And, the rest is history. But this is all about the early years and all those kind of, as the band really started to rise in popularity with all those classic early albums, a lot of the shenanigans and the, drunken crazy times and the women and the albums and the tours. It's all in here. I like that a lot. All right. What else? From Gary McGee, we've got Band on the Run, A History of Paul McCartney and Wings. I'm a huge fan of Paul McCartney and Wings, always was. Unfortunately, I'm not a huge fan of this book. It's okay, but, you know, at barely over 200 pages, I think, I don't know, personally, I think there's more of the story to tell than what they told in here. You know, Gary obviously likes the band, but, you know, it's basically a very quick retrospective of Paul McCartney and Wings. I know most people, when they talk Paul McCartney, they want to tell the Beatles story. But quite frankly, he was, you know, he had a huge success all throughout the 70s with Wings, and a lot of stuff happening. You know, the tours, the albums, all that kind of stuff. So I would love someone to write a more in-depth tale of this band. That's just me personally. Again, not a terrible book, but I was pretty disappointed. All right, back to Martin Popoff again. Just finished this morning, as a matter of fact. This is Fighting My Way Back, Thin Lizzy, 1969 to 76. So Martin has written 3 books on Thin Lizzy. Each one chronicles a certain chunk in the band's career. So this is the first third of their career. So this the very early days. So from Phil's time in Skid Row with Gary Moore to that first lineup with Brian Downey and Eric Bell, those first bunch of albums. Some cool little tidbits of, you know, after Eric Bell left and the brief little lineup in between before Scott Gorham and Brian Robertson joined the band, where they finally really hit upon the Thin Lizzy sound. Of course, in Martin's style, he goes and talks about all those albums, so all those early albums. So it's basically the first 3 albums with Eric Bell, and then the Nightlife album, Fighting, all the way up to Jailbreak. Okay, that's what's covered in here. Pretty cool stuff. A lot of like interview snippets with various members of the band. A lot of photographs live in the studio. You know, concert posters, things like that. Another very, very good book from Mr. Popoff. All right, I've got so many more here, but I'm gonna leave us with one more, and then I'll save the rest for another episode. So here is one. This came out a few years ago. You know, all the more important since we've lost him not that long ago. This, of course, is Jack Bruce composing himself, the Authorized Biography by Harry Shapiro. I really dug this one a lot. I think, you know, most people think of, like, you know, especially Cream, people always gravitate towards, you know, Ginger Baker, who's a little bit nuts, and Eric Clapton, but I think this guy right here was just as interesting an individual who went on to do a lot of different things in music over the years. A lot of different things. Talk a lot about it here. Also another guy who had a lot of demons. So if you're interested in reading about like kind of all what went on behind the crazy scenes and like, you know, when he played with Leslie West and Corky Lang, that's here in graphic detail. You got some chapters of when he was playing with Mick Taylor. Kind of cool. You got some stuff in here when he was with, you know, doing the British blues thing before Cream. And some of his forays into jazz in the 70s and the 80s, his hooking up with Gary Moore. You know, it's all in here. It's all in here. Pretty cool. You know, the guy was a musical genius. He was a musical genius. So anyway, with that, we're going to end this one. Till next time, I am Pete Pardo. Visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Twitter. We're on Facebook. So go find us. Subscribe to us, and of course we're here on the Mighty YouTube. So this is our part 3 of the rock biography and autobiography. I think we're going to squeeze one more in. I got enough for another episode, probably more than that, but you know, I don't want to make a habit of doing these. We got all sorts of other stuff to cover. So I'm glad you guys are enjoying this. It's actually cool for me to kind of go through and see all these great things that I've read. So till next time, take care. We'll see you again.